just real quickly. You all have this book here. You all have this book here. So I have other books too. You know, I have a large number, probably everybody that would want an additional supplementary. Yeah, I gave you these, right? So everybody has this book. And this book is similar to, many like it. That, it's a review book that goes over, various things. And so, I mean, one thing you could do is anticipating, our conversation, read a little bit about, some of the things that we're going to talk about in advance of it. It's going to reinforce some things. I mean, this book is pretty good, or, even try practice questions after. Any little thing that you do besides sort of attending this can only be helpful to our learning. But you say, dear instructor, learning about what? Well, today we wanted to pick up with the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as sort of a transformation from the colonial period that we talked about the first two review sessions, where we established 13 colonies, right? Eventually Plymouth is going to merge with Massachusetts Bay, and in the 1730s, Georgia is going to be founded. But we established 13 colonies, and then we talked a little bit about them. We talked a little bit about, the differences between the Chesapeake region and indentured servitude in New England, and the importance of the Puritan religion and settlement and communities and topography, geography. We talked about things that kind of connected the colonies, the Enlightenment, the Second Great Awakening, political connections. Not that they had political connections, but they shared a common political experience, in that every colony had some kind of royal authority, a governor, somebody, a representative legislature, trial by jury, ideas of rights of freeborn British subjects. All were things that the colonies held in common, but they really didn't have any kind of connection to them. And this is evident when I say they didn't have any kind of political connections. They may have had trade relations with one another, but kind of the divided nature or the isolated nature of the colonial possessions is clear over the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Now, when we first covered the 7 Years' War, and there's not really going to be a tremendous amount on the AP test. I'd say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, though, one of the free response questions was on the French and Indian War. But when we initially presented the French and Indian War, we did it as a fourth war between England and her allies and France and her allies. And we called these wars for empire. So England and her allies and France and her allies had battled 4 times, beginning in the late 1600s, I think 1692, 1690, somewhere in there was the first war, and then there was a second, then there was a third. But none of these first 3 wars were conclusive. And so this kind of leads to a fourth war, and what we said was the area that really is in contention in this fourth and final war between England and her allies and France and her allies is western Pennsylvania, the Ohio River Valley. And we spoke a lot about the Ohio River Valley and kind of the dynamics of the beginning of the war, but that was largely because we live here. I mean, it's significant that Washington was chosen to deliver the message to the French commander, and that it was jointly claimed by both France and England. But I guess fundamentally what's important is shots are fired in the summer of 1754 in the wilderness of western Pennsylvania that are the first shots in the fourth and conclusive war between England and France. So, and that Washington shot those bullets. Now, we said this, and this connects to what we were talking about. We said that, look, in this fourth war, that England saw coming with France, and the colonies saw coming, there was a meeting. Britain called a meeting in Albany. So as Washington was walking back defeated at Fort Necessity, delegates from some of the northern colonies had convened in Albany, New York. The purpose of that Albany Congress, as it was called, was to lure the Iroquois Indian nation or confederation into an alliance with the British against the French for this coming conflict. But Ben Franklin, who is one of the leading lights there, pushes for an intercolonial Congress, an Albany Plan, that was what, as it was called. Now, the Albany Congress in the summer of 54 and the Albany Plan that comes out of the summer of 54 is probably fairly important, largely because it is rejected. None of the colonial legislatures, nor did England, was England interested in any kind of intercolonial government. And what's interesting about this is 1754. So 1754, faced with the prospect of the French and the Native Americans, which is a very real and dangerous prospect to people on the frontier, the colonies were not willing to surrender any kind of sovereignty to one another in order to protect themselves. And England was not interested in seeing them unify for that purpose. And so, I mean, that sort of was significant. Probably more significant than Braddock's defeat in 55, eventually sort of the Britain turning around, the war effort in 56 and then in 57, and eventually in North America in 1760, taking, Quebec and Montreal and essentially ending the war with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. But even in the aftermath of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, and we made a big deal about this, and I was far more excited about this than you were. We said, look, that as they were negotiating this final fourth peace treaty in London that would end this war, there was a discussion, should we take Canada? And this is England saying this, should we take Canada, because Canada was a French possession, or should we take Martinique? And the fear of taking Canada is if Canada is gone and it becomes an English possession, will the colonists not need us any longer and eventually unify and rebel? And that's eventually what happens. But Franklin dismissed that. Remember, we said that it's not merely improbable. Franklin said, a union amongst the colonies is not merely improbable, it is impossible. That they will never unify together. That they like England much more than they like one another. And that was sort of the context that we attempted to set when we took the road to the Revolution. Because the road to the American Revolution really fundamentally starts with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. So the French and Indian War ends. This is glorious. England is never more powerful. Its empire never stronger. I mean, its influence never wider. It had defeated its most hated rival. It was at the pinnacle of its power and influence. We said the American colonists were large, the colonies were large and prosperous, a premier part of the British Empire. Americans were proud of their role in the 7 Years' War. They were proud to be part of the British Empire. No one would have suspected that in, less than 30 years, right? Less than that, less than 20 years, less than 15 years, these colonies would revolt. And so the question is, why? And really, there's lots of explanations, and you wrote a paper about that where you had to, I think you wrote the paper where you had to judge, was the nature of the revolution more economic or was it more political? And you had to make a case to do that. But part of making that case was a knowledge of kind of the important events. And, this book here kind of divides them into things, and I'm sure you have notations on them. But we talked about the various things that Britain does. I mean, Britain changes in the aftermath of the French and Native. They have challenges. And their challenges are dealing with this big, unruly empire. And so they're going to take actions to try to bring it under control, to try to right their financial situation, to try to, tighten up on mercantilism in order to keep control of their empire. And we talked about various things. One of the things that we talked about that Britain does under the title of of keeping their empire under control was the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763. Does anybody recall what was at issue with that proclamation, besides the instructor and Worms? Go ahead, Worms.
Britain said basically you can't cross this line, and the Americans had felt that they just fought a war for that line, for everything over that line.
So the line that you speak of, the proclamation line that you speak of, ran down the Appalachian Mountains, right? And the British government proclaimed in 1763 that white settlers could not go west of that line, and any white settlers that were west of that line had to go back. Now, what prompted this proclamation? That's an odd thing to say. Go ahead, Dick Arness.
The conflict with Native Americans.
Remember what the name of that conflict was? Prominent in this area, recall, Alex? Pontiac's Rebellion. Remember Pontiac's Rebellion? Pontiac's Rebellion, to some extent, was resolved at Bushy Run. That was the key battle, the Battle of Bushy Run. But Pontiac's Rebellion was this, backlash from the Native Americans in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. And Britain sort of, wanting to address this, not wanting to pay for an army to protect the frontier necessarily, takes an expedient action of pushing the colonists back. Well, this proclamation of 1763, what Britain might have considered a reasonable response to a challenge, is something that the colonists react sort of violently to. How can you do this? I mean, by 1763, remember, these colonies had been established for well over 100 years. They were used to, with very little interference, governing themselves. And so these kind of edicts from a faraway parliament and a faraway king were troubling, particularly people that believed, as somebody said, that they had fought to acquire this territory. Beyond the proclamation of 1763, we also talked about a battle over the writs of assistance. Remember, British customs officials in New England wanted the assistance of these global search warrants to try to snuff out smuggling and enforce mercantilism. And we said there was a significance to the battle over the writs. Oh, who was instrumental in arguing against the writs of assistance? Dear Christian, do you recall? Oh, you must recall this, yes. James Otis, right? James Otis. James Otis was hired by those New England merchants to argue against the writs of assistance. And remember, we said in Otis's argument against the writs, John Adams, who is a witness of that trial, is going to argue 50 years later that right then and there the child independence was born. Now, why, dear Murray, would John Adams, who had seen it all, remember, say, look, right there and then the child independence was born? What was so influential about Otis's argument in that courtroom on that day? Oh, remember that day in our class, how interesting that was. We were ready to crawl out of our skins. It was so darn interesting. Do you remember that day, Murray? Apparently not. Yes, go ahead, Turgeon. Otis argued that the writs of assistance violated the colonists' natural rights. And so this notion of natural rights is kind of left on the table. Now, let's take a second and talk about that, because that's important. Ultimately what Otis is going to argue is that the writs of assistance violated the natural rights of the colonists. A natural rights argument goes back to a lot of English thinkers, including and prominently John Locke. And remember, Locke, an enlightened thinker, is going to argue that by birth, and this is a British notion, that by birth, people have certain unalienable rights. You are born with the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, what Locke contended, and what many people in Britain kind of agreed with, is in a state of nature, you can't protect those rights from your neighbors. In a state of nature, without government, your neighbor will take your life. Your neighbor will take your property. Your neighbor is going to, take your liberty, enslave you. So, in a state of nature, you can't protect your natural rights from your neighbor. So what people collectively do, and this is a key word in Locke's argument, is they contract with government, a contract. They make a deal. Listen, government, listen, king, if you protect and ensure my rights, I'll listen to what you have to say. But the purpose of government in the Lockean sort of ideology, or the idea of natural rights, the purpose of government was to protect and ensure the natural rights of the people. Now, what Otis is arguing is that this is a violation of our natural rights. Now, the argument of natural rights is going to be there over the writs of assistance, and then the argument of natural rights is going to be there when we get to the Stamp Act as well. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, when Otis proclaims that taxation without representation is tyranny, taxation without representation is theft, taxation without representation is a violation of natural rights. Now, this is a sort of an ideological justification that the colonists are going to give to justify their opposition to the actions that Britain is making. Now, we made reference to a series of financial things just a second ago. And I mean, and you kind of got Britain in the aftermath of the French and Indian War saying, okay, we're going to tighten up on kind of our imperial policy. We're going to push everybody back over the Appalachian Mountains, and so we can handle the Native Americans there, and we're going to tighten up on our trade and all this smuggling that's going on and salutary neglect. We're going to tighten up on that with the writs of assistance. And by the way, we need money. And we fought these 4 wars, and we fought for you people, and you people should appreciate it. So we are going to tax you for the purpose of generating revenue. We want you to contribute. We want you to contribute to maintaining a standing army of 10,000 men within North America, within the colonies. Now remember, British people were nervous of a standing army to begin with, but having to pay for a standing army was something different. Now we talked about the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, and the Sugar Act, right? Is that right, Jessica? Currency,
Yes.
Quartering, Sugar Act. Those 3 pieces of legislation as being the first swipe of George Grenville in an attempt to sort of get money out of colonial America. But the most significant, and if you wanted to organize kind of, the road to the revolution, you could organize it this way. You could talk about the Stamp Act and the response to it, the Townsend Acts and the response to it, and the Tea Act and the response to it. And, I mean, you have things before the Stamp Act, like the Proclamation and the writs of assistance. But it's almost like, okay, the British really come in and say, look, we need money, and we're going to tax these stamps, and you're going to have to buy these stamps, and it's going to generate revenue, and we do this in England, and you should be grateful that you're part of the British Empire, and you should contribute. And the colonists rise in protest. And they argue, this is taxation without representation. We have no representatives in Parliament. Parliament can't do this. This is theft. This is a violation of our natural rights. What, incidentally, does the British say in response to that? A good word. Yes, virtual representation. They said, listen, we understand this idea about taxation without representation, but you are represented. You are represented. You are virtually represented. Every member of Parliament represents everybody. Now, the colonists are never going to buy that argument. That argument is never going to be something colonial Americans are going to accept. And the British are never really going to relinquish it. But for here, the Stamp Act is protested in a number of ways. The Stamp Act Congress is fairly significant. The Stamp Act is passed, and there is lots of protests. Patrick Henry, the resolutions on the floor of the Virginia Purges, boycotts against British products, the emergence of the Sons of Liberty. One of the things we didn't spend a lot of time talking about is the Stamp Act Congress. Delegates from several of the colonies went together and generated resolutions in opposition to the Stamp Act. This is in 65. This is in 1765. But the Stamp Act Congress is significant, not because they did anything meaningful, but that they joined together for mutual action, something they were not willing to do in the Albany Congress. Now, The Declaratory Act repeals the Stamp Act. What did it say? What did it say? Go ahead, Turkey. Right. The Declaratory Act was a statement of kind of ideology. Look, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but that's not because we agree with your argument. We still declare that Parliament is supreme. Oh, we talked about a lot of things. Do you know why, Luke, we talked about so many things? Because I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but over the summer, I had traveled to Brown University. Have I ever mentioned that, Luke? In the summer, I traveled to Brown University. No? Yeah. But I mean, we were interested in this. We were interested in all these ideas. You know, ideas about why these people responded in the way that they did. You know, and the Stamp Act Congress kind of represents some sort of transformation. The Declaratory Act is a statement that the colonists ignore for the most part. Then come the Townsend duties. How are the Townsend duties different from the Stamp Act? Does anyone recall besides the instructor? Go ahead, sir. Yes. Wow, that's good. They were internal taxes. Taxes on British imports into colonial America, which seemed to be a sneaky way to do the same thing. Opposition to these taxes took a lot longer to generate, but was still there. One of the big leading figures that opposed them was a guy named John Dickinson. What was he famous for, John Dickinson? Does that anybody recall? Go ahead, Turkey. Letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. Yeah, farmer in Pennsylvania, where he argued, you know, taxation without representation in any form is a violation of the rights of the colonists. Now, DiMatteo, I will tell you this, that Dickinson is a very conservative colonist. He is somebody that is generally supportive of Britain. And remember, in the final analysis, Dickinson refuses to vote for independence. He supports it, but he doesn't vote for it. Now, I think the letters from a farmer in PA represent some sort of a colonial consensus that most people thought that the actions of Britain were wrong. Now, eventually there's going to be disagreement as to whether independence is the solution to that. But Dickinson represents sort of a conservative, wealthy, influential lawyer's position that the Townsend duties are wrong. But really the Townsend duties sort of come to a head with the Boston Massacre. What's the connection? What's the connection with the Townsend duties and the Boston Massacre? How do those events connect? Go ahead, Dan. So you said, because I can barely hear you, so let me repeat it. They had to send troops, the British had to send troops to enforce the Townsend duties. Continue.
Yeah, and since the troops in the they
So those troops, I mean, remember we said those troops came over to assist in the enforcement of the Townsend duties, and they were in Boston, which was a hotbed for smuggling for months before there was a major incident. There were lots of minor incidents, but before there was a major incident. Oh, what was the name of that fellow, a powerfully built mulatto that was there at the Boston Massacre? Would anybody by chance know that?
Crispus Attucks.
Crispus Attucks. Really? Was he there? I hope that's on the test, because we will go 100%. Crispus Attucks. You'll probably write a little something extra in there. Let me tell you a little more about it. You know, and we spoke about the Boston Massacre, and we said, look, the Boston Massacre represents kind of a loss of life. You know, there's people are killed. Americans protesting, kind of the action of British soldiers are killed in what is considered to be a massacre. And you know, I suppose this is significant, but we said in the immediate aftermath of that, the Townsend duties, except for the tax on tea, is repealed, and there is a period of relative quiet. John Adams, in fact, defends the soldiers who were charged with murder as a result of the Boston Massacre. And remember, there are these economic things that Danny made mention of. You know, the soldiers were taking these guys' jobs, alcohol was an issue, the people that were there in the mob that night were the underclass in Boston. And that's an interesting thing, too. You know, why would the underclass in all of these cities be so angry at the British? And remember, we said Howard Zinn kind of argued in his piece it was kind of a conspiracy. The better class of people, you know, funneled the anger that was directed against them, against the British, so they could take control. You know, we talked about Nash making an argument that, look, you know, what the underclass saw this as an opportunity to reshape, you know, America differently. You know, so there was all kinds of ideas about, you know, what was happening, you know, with this. But we said, look, the immediate aftermath of the Boston Massacre is a period of relative quiet. Right? 1770, from 1770 to 1773, there is a period of relative quiet. What breaks it wide open, Andrew? What breaks that relative quiet wide open? A piece of legislation. I mean, remember, Parliament relaxed all the Townsend duties except for the tax on tea. And even though the troublemakers, Otis and Adams and Hancock, tried to keep, you know, vigilant about this, it kind of crumbled, it kind of fizzled. But what happened? In 1773, Parliament took an action, Andrew, you must know this. I should be able to get you out of your bed at 2 o'clock in the morning and ask you this, and you should know it. Garness, if I was shaking you at 2 a.m., Garness, get up. What broke the relative quiet of 1773? What would you say? Yes, the Tea Act. Shaking, I could be shaking the bedpan at 2 a.m. and waking you up, and you should say, absolutely, the Tea Act. Right, the Tea Act. What prompted this piece of legislation? DeMattia, you are a person that spent a lot of time studying the colonial period. What prompted this piece of legislation, the Tea Act?
I'm not sure.
Worms?
The floundering of the British East India Company.
Ah, what a wondrous word, floundering. Yeah, this is an excellent word. Yes, and yeah, you could say that. The floundering of the British East India Company was struggling, and they wanted, it was a bailout, piece of bailout legislation. So to bail out the British East India Company, the Tea Act was passed, and what Phillips did it do? What was so troubling about this Tea Act? I'll call on Garness if you make it. I'll do it. I don't care. Go ahead, Garness. Let it rip.
Force keeping the colonies to only buy the tea from the British.
Yeah, it's going to cut out the middlemen between the British East India Company and the direct retailers in colonial America. And the net result would be cheaper tea, even if the Townsend duty on tea was paid. And the response to this was many of the colonies didn't like it. You know, they thought that this was dangerous precedent that was set, that was trying to enforce the dreaded tea tax that they didn't like. And so the big response, what's the big, dramatic kind of, oh my goodness, December of 1773, the big response. DeMattia, should I give you another chance? For the big response to the Tea Act was what? It's Boston. It's December 16th. It's 1768. What did he say? The Boston Tea Party, right? And so the Boston Tea Party is this dramatic destruction of British East India tea that changes things. Now, Marissa, do you recall the response of the British to the Boston Tea Party? Oh, they were mad. That's true. They were, darn it, they were mad. But they took their anger out in a tangible way. Baker, do you recall? Yes, they closed the port of Boston. They passed a series of measures. What do we call those measures, Deirdre? Oh, there are two names. Are there not, Jessica? Two names. What are they?
Coercive.
The coercive and or the intolerable acts, which were vindictive pieces of legislation that were forced, that were passed to punish Boston for their actions. The British Parliament arguing that they had had enough. They had had enough and they were done. And so they were going to react to that by passing this legislation. The British East India Company had to be paid. The port of Boston was shut down. Boston was put under military rule. The governor was replaced by the military leader, General Gage. Now, what's the big response by colonial America in general? Not just the Bostonians, not just the Massachusetts people or the Massachusettsians, I don't know if that's a word, but what was the response of colonial Americans in general to the intolerable acts, to the surprise of Britain? Go ahead, Lucy LeMayo. Yazvac, go ahead. Alex, go ahead. How?
Ms. Paul, 5740, Ms. Strotman, 5740.
I'll call on Coulter if I have to. Go ahead, Coulter.
The First Continental Congress?
Yes. They called for a First Continental Congress. Now, First Continental Congress is September of 1774. September of 1774. Now remember, we are 2 years in September of 1774, 2 years to independence, which is July of 1774. But the First Continental Congress really wasn't talking about that. They weren't talking about independence. They were still talking about rights, still protesting British actions, still looking to see those actions repealed. Jessica, tell me one thing that came of the Congress.
Is it to begin to arm yourself?
Well, one of the things they said is, look, we protest, these things that are happening. We don't recognize Britain's right to do this. We support the Bostonians, and we encourage the colonists to arm themselves. Why? To defend their rights, not for independence. And remember, they said, look, if we need to, we will meet again in May of 75. Now, what happens is they need to, right? In the interim between the Continental Congress's adjournment and May of 75, General Gage is ordered from Boston to move on a suspected outpost of rebellious colonists. He was ordered to go and destroy ammunition and capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who he believed was in Concord, Massachusetts, 20 miles outside of Boston. Wow. Wow, Elizabeth Yazvac, wasn't that a day in class? When we marched to Concord and Lexington. Oh, do you remember, Murray, when we were on Lexington Green? Right, Lexington Green, the sleepy colonist standing against the mightiest military in the planet. Disperse ye rebels. Who uttered those words, dear students? Disperse ye rebels. Who said that, do you recall? Major John Pitcairn. Do you recall that? Major John Pitcairn ordered the rebels to disperse. A shot was fired on Lexington Green. The shot heard round the world, led to an engagement and loss of life, on to Concord, and then the British troops are going to march back to Boston. By the time they get back to Boston, I want to say they lost over 200 men. Shots had been fired, blood had been shed. The incidents in Concord and Lexington are the first significant battles of the Revolutionary War. Now, the Second Continental Congress meets in a crisis environment, right? The Second Continental Congress meets in May of 1775. And when they do meet in May of 1775, they are going to do a couple of things. One is they are going to put forth the Olive Branch Petition. Oh, remember we watched that on the John Adams miniseries? That was pretty good. I liked it. Maybe the kids, they don't. Shannon, remember we watched that on the John Adams miniseries when, they were debating the Olive Branch Petition. One last appeal to the king to intervene in this situation, and the Olive Branch Petition was rejected by the king. And when the olive branch petition was rejected sort of simultaneously, Congress voted to sort of form a military. And the head of that military would be, in fact, George Washington. And George Washington is dispatched to Massachusetts to lead the forces of resistance against the British there. Now, this is in the summer of 1775, in the aftermath of Concord and Lexington. There is still kind of a significant debate in that Second Continental Congress about what to do. What do we do? Shots have been fired, blood has been shed. We appealed to the king. He has rejected our appeal. He's declared us in rebellion. We're forming an army. What do we do? Do we follow through with independence? And remember, at the Second Continental Congress, there were some Virginians and some New Englanders that wanted to move towards independence. But you had the South Carolinians and the Georgians, and you also had the middle colonies that were reluctant to do so. And there is a kind of a significant battle between these factions that goes through 1775 into 1776. Now, there are things that happen that keep further alienating the colonies from Britain. The colonists are declared to be in a state of rebellion. The Hessians are hired in order to come and put down the rebellion. But the big thing that turns the tide of public opinion against Britain was what? I'll call upon you, Bolin. You, Bolin, of all people, should know this. The tide of public opinion turns against the British and turns towards independence upon what? Go ahead, Bolin. Jowsey, let it rip. What turns the tide of public opinion? Whoop. Common sense. Did you know that, DiMatteo?
Yep.
Darn you. Darn you, DiMatteo. You're a lot smarter than people give you credit for. Yes, indeed. Common sense. Common sense. Oh, DiMatteo, I'll give you another one. Who wrote that tract?
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine. You read it in English, did you not? Common Sense, right? Yes? No? No? Parts of Common Sense? We said the value of common sense is that was written kind of in the language of the people, understandable. It made common sense. The tide of public opinion turned. Lots of people read it. Almost everybody read it or had it read to them or were familiar with it. And so as the summer of 1776 is approaching, the tide of public opinion is turning. And in June of 1776, Richard Henry Lee, representing the Virginia delegation at the Second Continental Congress, makes the fateful resolution that these colonies are and ought to be independent. Now, once that resolution is made, there is, committees that are dispatched. One committee is dispatched to kind of reduce the resolution to writing. An explanation of why they were going to embark on independence. Another committee was dispatched to formulate a system of central government. Now, we know about the one. We know that John Adams and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, made up the majority of this committee that was going to write this Declaration of Independence. We know that Thomas Jefferson was the primary author of the first draft of this declaration. The other committee, incidentally, was headed by John Dickinson. Dickinson, who had voted or did not intend to vote to support independence, but was chosen to write or to formulate a system of central government. That's the committee that comes up with what we call the Articles of Confederation. The other committee comes up with the Declaration of Independence. Now, we did the Declaration of Independence numerous times. We did it like the first week of class. We said, look, this is the central document of American history. It's the genesis of sort of the beginning of the country. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their creators with certain inalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We said this was in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, the core of what explained why Americans were doing what they were doing. Fundamentally, what we argued, that Jefferson argued, is that British actions constituted an intolerable violation of the natural rights of Americans. That being the case, it was their duty, right? It was their right, it was their duty to throw off that government and replace it with one that would protect and ensure their rights, and that's what they were doing. So that's a big deal. And remember, we said, look, the question was, how did we get there? How did we get from these isolated outposts of settlements to sort of a consensus of independence based on these premises? How did it get from there? And that question is kind of unsettled. We tried to think about that. I wanted to, and I argued this is a big deal. This is a truly liberal notion. We didn't define liberality, I guess, until we got to Wilson and Roosevelt. But the core of being a liberal is faith in humanity, that people are good. Well, you don't want evil people governing themselves. That wouldn't make sense, right? If you say, look, the power of government comes from the consent of the governed, that notion is at the core liberal, because it suggests that the people are worth or capable of governing themselves, of determining this. So in some ways we argue that the Declaration of Independence is a liberal document. Now some of you might not like that, entirely, they call it a liberal document, but if it takes the sting out of it, worms for you, that's liberal in the classical sense, not in the modern sense, right? In the classical sense, because they didn't use faith in the people. Now, once we had the Declaration, now we have an official war. But I'll just say this just very quickly. The official war, is now with a country. The United States is a nation that basically is only recognized by ourselves. The British don't recognize our independence. At first, the French don't recognize our independence. The Spanish don't recognize our independence. The Dutch don't recognize our independence. We are a country that is only recognized by ourselves. Now we are going to fight for kind of a general recognition, in particular from Britain. And, troops are gathered, a system of government is developed, And another thing that we talked about, and I promise I'll conclude with this, is that once that Declaration of Independence was published, then people had to choose what they were going to do. Were they going to support this formal cause? Right? The cause now was for independence, which was ultimately treason. Were they going to support this cause, or were they going to remain loyal to Britain? Now, lots of the people that decide to remain loyal to Britain don't like, some of the actions that Britain took. But they don't feel that independence is justified or right or the best course of action. And we said, look, there was a significant, number of loyalists. And that part of the war in America was a war between those who supported independence and those who opposed it, and between the British and the Americans that supported independence. And particularly in the South, that was true. Now, in terms of the war, I think all you really need to know is Saratoga. I don't know, probably the two things that might be asked about the war is the importance of the Battle of Saratoga and the impact that the war may have had on slavery, in particular. Remember, the war was fought in New England, then it moved to the Middle Colonies, and then it moved to the South. The battle in the Middle Colonies came to a head in 1777 with Saratoga. And Saratoga was a stunning British defeat. Now, why was that battle so important? What happens? Go ahead, Andrew, you're back. You're stronger than ever. Go ahead. Yes. So what does France do? France they're the first country to recognize our independence. Now you see the Libyans, the Libyan is our fighting against Gaddafi, right? And the rebels, the Libyan rebels, are recognized now by the French and the Italians, and the Qatarians, or the Qatarines, I guess they call them, the people from Qatar, recognize the Libyan rebels as the legitimate government of Libya. Well, the United States of America was not recognized by anybody, right? Until France recognizes us in October of 1777. French recognition is everything. Because now it's an alliance, now it's overt aid, now it is recognition, now it is loans. I mean, the French recognition means everything, and that recognition comes on the heels of the Battle of Saratoga. That's why that battle is so important. All right, well, we'll pick up there with the Battle of Saratoga when we resume this discussion. So we're all